Hello, welcome everybody to this very special event hosted by the London School of Economic Sociology Department. My name's Glyn Robbins. I'm a visiting fellow at the department. My day job is as a housing worker, and I'm also involved in various housing and anti-racist campaigns and as a trade unionist. At the beginning of lockdown in the UK, all those weeks ago, I was invited to read and review this book, and made quite an impact on me even then, and I was recommending it to people even before the seismic events that have taken place since and that continue not just in the US but globally. So it's really great to be able to listen in to a discussion involving both the book's authors but also facilitated by Professor Robin Kelley, who's going to lead the discussion in a moment with the two authors, John Wiener and Mike Davis. So I'm going to hand it over to Robin in a moment. They'll have a discussion amongst themselves, if you will, but with all of you listening in. And we'd like you to be a part of that discussion. So if you do have points or questions, if you could use social media of some form or another to text them in, and we will then try and feed them into the discussion. So let me formally welcome and thank Robin Kelley, who is a writer from Los Angeles, UCLA, and has written extensively on US social movements and particularly the African American experience, and I think most interesting in some ways about jazz and its place in American culture. Also Mike Davis, a writer from San Diego, and to his co-author of the book, John Wiener. John is a professor of history from UCLA. So I'm going to hand over to him with just one very brief comment from me about what I see as what's happening at the moment. And it really is summarized by Diane Yentel, who is a representative of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition in the US. And Diane has recently said that a direct line connects America's history of racist housing policies to today's over-policing and disinvestment in Black and brown communities. So with that thought in mind, over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be here, especially with two of my great heroes, two writers, scholars, activists who I've been following for like 3 decades. And they have produced this magnificent book, one that I can't imagine anyone not wanting to read and jump into. It's 800 pages, but it reads quickly because you're basically catching the pulse of a moment through Los Angeles, but one that is actually global, and we'll talk about that. So I want to begin really by talking about we're asking about the present. I mean, we're in this really interesting moment where even 5 seconds ago, something has changed. You know, cities are burning. Some are all over the globe. People are basically exploding all over the world. LA is one of those epicenters. And, you know, they're for reasons one you might have predicted, but what's interesting about this kind of global social movement, this uprising at the sort of end, not the end of, but in the midst of a pandemic, is that these uprisings are not specifically over climate change. They're not specifically over the ravages of capitalism, like, say, Occupy, though that's part of it. But they're over state-sanctioned racial violence. And this is what prompted this. And this book, Set the Night on Fire, suggests why we shouldn't be surprised that this particular moment is a catalyst. And of course, as they say, there's not always just one catalyst, you know, but we shouldn't be surprised, though, even though the result was necessarily not, even in the 1960s, we may not have seen the kind of mobilization, the scope or the scale of this mobilization, but we saw elements of it, including white kids holding placards saying, you know, stop the killing of Black people by the police, which shocks everyone. So what I'd like to ask both Mike and John about, and you could, either one of you can take this, or both of you hopefully, is what can we learn from the history that you've put together from the 60s and early 70s about the current moment. What is it? LA at the outset was a very unlikely place for a kind of revolutionary movement or insurgency. It was ultra-conservative, white supremacist, segregated, a police state. But but very similar events erupted both before and even after the Watts Rebellion that really in some ways reflect on the current moment, but then there's some things that are very different. So I'd love you to just begin there, reflect on that.
Well, the most striking thing to me is how multicultural today's protests are in Los Angeles. They're not compared to, the reference point here, of course, is the Watts Rebellion of 1965, which was confined to the Black neighborhood of South Los Angeles in fighting against the LAPD. For the last 2 weeks, what we've seen in LA is protest marches and demonstrations everywhere in Southern California. This weekend, there was one in Newport Beach, which is the whitest, wealthiest, most Republican place in Southern California. If hundreds of young people are marching in Newport Beach, something has changed, in America. The other big change is that Black Lives Matter turns out to be amazingly effective as a political force. I mean, a year ago, it seemed like they were, an inspiring protest group. They had a rally 2 weeks ago in Pan Pacific Park. 20,000 people came. The rally demanded defund the police. The mayor announced he wanted to increase the police budget by 7% or something like that. More recently, Black Lives Matter held a demonstration outside the home of the mayor. 1,000 people showed up, and the next day he announced he was in favor of cutting the police budget by $150 million. Now he's talking about $250 million. So Black Lives Matter suddenly is like a tremendously effective political group changing city policy, things which were unimaginable just a couple of weeks ago are now common sense in Los Angeles. Yeah, the city council wants to do it. The mayor wants to do it. I guess we're going to do it.
Mike, do you want to add to that?
Well, first of all, there's a very dark aspect to all this, which is that despite 20 years of claims that the Los Angeles Police Department has been reformed and kinder, gentler, it's now multicultural. You watch the videos from Los Angeles, and those could have been videos from 1963, 1965. Some people say defunding the police or radically changing the structure of the police is too big a step to take right now. It's clear that it is the only solution. You have to extirpate the culture of the LAPD entirely and build something new, something based in the community. It's also noteworthy the economic dimension of these protests. Black America has suffered not simply depression, but something like an economic firestorm since 2008. The recession then erased most of the net wealth in the form of home ownership and equity for African Americans across the country and for Latinos as well. And now tens of millions of people of color have just seen the roof fall on their heads. Unemployment rates that are unlikely to budge with the ridiculously small efforts that are being made. And this is one of the roots of the protests too, and it was back in 1965. I graduated high school in '64, and if you weren't drafted, I could get up in the morning and ask myself, do I want to be an auto worker? Do I want to drive a truck? Do I want to work in a rubber factory? there was just a full employment economy for whites. It was an exceptional moment, particularly for people from blue-collar white backgrounds like me. But in South Central LA, unemployment was increasing and continued to increase. And because of the scale of the catastrophe that's happened to Black America, that's happened to Latino America, I think the movements that we're seeing right now will continue and grow and metamorphosize into something much broader on a much larger scale than we saw in the 1960s.
Right. Well, one of the points you both make in the book, which is so clear, is the use of arrest records, convictions, just the police repression in South LA and also in East LA, and how those arrest records kept people from getting jobs. In other words, you can have a robust growing economy, but still, the LAPD plays a role in the discrimination in the workplace. And that was a big issue. And then something else you also point out is the way that Mayor Yorty and his whole ilk basically sat on millions of dollars of war and poverty money because they're not willing to follow at least the gesture of maximum feasible participation. That is to democratize the process of who decides how this money is being used, and so in some ways it was a kind of the repressive arm of the state becomes another means to tamp down Black employment and brown employment opportunities and tamp down wages, in an economy that we'd think is robust and growing. And I want, if you could talk about that. And one other thing I just wanted to mention, because I think, it is so true, what you said, John, Black Lives Matter, both the slogan and the movement for Black Lives as a movement, has been really successful. And we know they've been successful because they have been relentlessly organizing since 2012. And the fact that people could speak as common sense, the idea of defunding the police is something that's not crazy, but makes perfect sense. That has everything to do with all that work. And one of the beautiful things you do in this book is you lay out not just the political, but the intellectual and communications infrastructure that made organizing possible. I mean, whether we're talking about KPFK, or whether we're talking about bookstores, whether we're talking about, connections between groups from peace action, feminist organizations, that people are talking about and thinking about, what does this future look like? In Watts, the cultural renaissance that exploded after all that wasn't like an accident. It was part of a kind of social, cultural, and artistic network of struggle. And so if you could just talk about these two things, that is, one, the relationship between policing and unemployment and the kind of economic violence, but also the kind of intellectual and social and political infrastructure that also made possible a movement as opposed to just an explosion. Either one.
Well, for decades, the ACLU and Black community groups had been fighting the police, suing the police, demanding that the LAPD change its ways. So there always was a core of organizing and resistance to the LAPD. In the 50s, the ACLU was suing the police, and in the 60s, there were community groups in South LA. Watts was a turning point, particularly for what we might call alternative media, the LA Free Press, mm-hmm. the underground newspaper of Los Angeles, the biggest underground newspaper of the 60s, got launched. It had existed before the Watts Rebellion of 1965. It was founded in 64, but it was the Watts Uprising that launched the LA Free Press as an important voice voice that eventually ended up with 250,000 readers, especially in contrast to the LA Times, which was run by a conservative elite family and always supported the police, always supported the racist mayor. If you just contrast the headlines, when the Watts Rebellion began, the LA Times headline was "Anarchy Must End." The LA Free Press headline was "The Negroes Have Spoken." And that was an announcement that there was now an organized news institution for young people, white young people, based on Sunset Strip, distributed by hippies selling on street corners, that had Black people writing for it. I mean, the editor was a guy named Art Kunken, who came out of the old left. He was not a 60s kid. He had worked with CORE in the years just before that. So the LA Times had no Black writers. The LA Free Press had some Black writers. So I mean, that marked a turning point. And then, of course, the listener-supported radio station KPFK, by the time of the Watts Rebellion, had an important program hosted by Dorothy Healey, who was the head of the Communist Party of Southern California, with the bold name Communist Commentary. And she had Black people weekly on the radio.
Mike?
I think that really the crucial infrastructure for organization and revolt was probably the high schools on both the east side and the south side. And one of the things we try and do in this book is shift the focus from the usual suspects, movement leadership and organizations, and look directly at the social forces themselves. And so we discovered, and this was a surprise to me, even though I was there for much of this period, that really the largest sustained protests organized out of the high schools, and in some cases, even the junior high schools. There was a junior high school called Carver in South Central that became a kind of theater of police brutality and resistance by kids as young as 13 and 14 years old, who'd built an independent connection to a new Black majority community college called Southwestern. But it was the high school cliques. It was the athletic connections. And it was also, of course, the gangs of the period. They were very much different from what would follow later in the 1980s. So people knew each other. People who maybe had been competitors, rivals, enemies after the rebellion felt joined together by profound kind of solidarity that had risen. And unfortunately, too much social history fails to look at these kind of microstructures of revolt and resistance. But we can see the same thing operating now. I mean, I'm a very old man, but my younger children, I still have 2 kids in high school. And it's just amazing how the resistance in San Diego has grown up. So much of it out of high school groups, informally organized. Like my youngest daughter belongs to, I should say also that my kids are Mexican, so they're not really white kids. But my younger daughter has a clique of kids, Black and brown. And they immediately started, organizing themselves and produced one of the biggest demonstrations. And they did this with astonishing speed and ease. And there was never any question, at that point at least, of the need for an organization or even a need for leaders. I mean, Robin, you're entirely right. Black Lives Matter laid much of the groundwork for this. But an awful lot of it is spontaneous. It's organized by informal groups of kids. And one of the striking things about LA is that the high school rebellion of the 60s has reappeared again and again. And the protests against anti-immigrant Proposition 187 and other huge immigration protests. And today, the high schools blow out, you know, the Kids Act. We should start maybe paying a lot more attention to people under 18.
Right, right.
And let me just add that the high school activists of especially of 1968 and 1969, a lot of them, this was a lifelong thing. They're still with us. I mean, Harry Gamboa, for example, an artist, photographer, was a prominent high school activist in the Chicano moratorium. Went on to UCLA. Now he teaches at CalArts. You know, he's out there right now in the streets taking pictures of today's high school kids. And the cover of our book, a lot of photographs in our book are taken by, you know, people who are still presently active, documenting things, and, you know, their children and grandchildren are going. So I think that's part of, I mean, that's the note we end on, you know, that this didn't stop. This is a generational phenomenon that is continuing, and after the events of the last couple of months is going to expand.
Right, right. Yeah, that was those chapters on the blowouts, the chapters on the predominantly Black high schools. We had the strike, the BSU strike, the LA Unified strike. I mean, those are extraordinary chapters, and it really does change. It will force us to change the way we write history, because we tend to think that everything at the youth level begins at the college level. And a part of it has to do with what documents we're looking at. I was wondering about this issue of generation, because the two striking things I took away, many things I took away from the book, but two very striking things about generation was A, how many really young people were at the forefront of this, and B, how many really old people. What I mean by that, there was a presence of the Communist Party, either former communists or even former Trotskyists, where this idea that there's a kind of the old left is left behind and the new left emerges doesn't pan out in this book the same way. The old left is very much present. And it's amazing how when you scratch the surface for all the anti-communism, there actually are real communists under there. And if you could just, both of you just comment on these generational legacies. And what I'm thinking specifically is the continuation of that legacy coming out of the 30s and 40s, and how it shaped the politics of LA in peace movements, in the gay and lesbian movements, in the Black movements, in the Chicano movements. But also, is there something unique about that generation of youth? In other words, is it just the character of youth, period? Or is it about a generation of youth that experienced, witnessed, or had the reverberations of Watts, so the reverberations of LAPD's police violence, the reverberations, which you talk about so powerfully, the struggle for Sunset Boulevard, you know, where young people are trying to fight for the right to have public space, which may seem, you know, trivial at first, but by the time those struggles are over, they're the ones holding up placards saying, free Huey Newton, you know, and police violence against Black people. So we could talk about those two generations and what they might tell us about how we understand that period, and maybe today.
Well, Los Angeles was unique in having a Communist Party, which in the late 1940s had almost 10,000 members and a huge broad influence. The party had concentrations of people literally everywhere. It was a major force in the CIO in Los Angeles and in the CIO's political organization. It was in Hollywood. It was in the Black community, including some of the very earliest and most important Black communists from the days of the formation of communism. And it operated as a small mass party on a metropolitan level that was able to help steer and drive a broader progressive coalition. Now, you might find comparable examples in other cities, but basically the alliances, the Popular Front alliances, were destroyed in the McCarthy period. This wasn't true in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles also had a party organizer, a woman named Dorothy Healey, who dropped out of high school when she was 16 to harangue the unemployed on the Oakland docks. He was an extraordinary person and one of the most intellectually and politically, perhaps the single most influential person for most of this period. And her orientation was to preserve these contexts, to challenge the illegality of the party and its banishment from public space. She was under indictment, as were other party leaders, threatened with prison for years and years. But as John will talk more about, she obtained a bully pulpit at KPFK. She was one of the first communists to speak on college campuses. And when I joined the Communist Party in 1968 with my wife, and at the same time Angela joined, the party was in open revolt against the National Party, supported Dubček and the Communist Reformation in Czechoslovakia post the Soviet invasion. And it also had a generation that's the kind of missing link, the missing generation in all this, which was the late 40s, 50s kids. And by and large across the country, there are a few people from that generation who were active. But LA had a really interesting core of people who became activists at the Los Angeles City College at the very beginning in the 60s, provided some of the early freedom riders and so on. And the position of Dorothy and the communist youth was to make as many ties as possible and friendships with the new left, which is how I was originally attracted to the party. It also had multiracial leadership. In fact, the youth leadership was largely Black. And Dorothy's attitude toward this was very interesting because at various points, we were involved in things that were very shocking to the National Committee and the national leadership in New York City. And Dorothy would just shrug her shoulders and say, quote Lenin, and say, well, youth has to come to socialism and its own ways. So her tiny little house on, what was it, 84th, right near Western in South Central LA, became a kind of one-person think tank. And you never know when you went to Dorothy's house and she's sitting in a chair, smoking a cigarillo, offering you a TV dinner, which is all she ever seemed to eat. But you never know who you'd find there. You might find part of the Panther leadership. You might find a Democratic politician sneaking in discreetly to talk, to talk politics of it. So LA is, in that sense, the great exception, where the old left remained relevant, where there was some contingent of the late 40s, 50s kids. Some of them ended up in prominent roles. The ex-mayor of Santa Monica, Paul Rosenstein, was one of the 50s people, along with a group of others. So LA in so many ways defies the ruling stereotypes of the 1960s and of the generational relationships. But John should talk more about the kids on the strip.
Well, there's one other connection between the Communist Party and the movements of the 60s that we we write about in our book, and that is the leadership of the gay movement in LA. The Communist Party expelled homosexual members. Dorothy, had to, national party policy was to kick out the gay men because they were considered a security risk. They could be blackmailed by the FBI. But a lot of these ex-communists were still, wildly red. And some of them went on to organize gay groups. And LA had one in particular, Morris Kite, wonderful guy. Mike knew him. I never met him. Los Angeles had the first public street protest against police raids on gay bars. 2 years before Stonewall, LA gays were picketing against LAPD raiding the Black Cat Bar in Silver Lake. It's got a historic marker outside it today. And a lot of the work in organizing gay LA came from ex-communists who'd been against their own wishes kicked out of the party, but maintained their organizing skills and their political orientation. LA also had the first gay publication, The Advocate, the first gay pride parade, the first time pride was used. We've got pride coming up in the next couple of weeks. LA is the place that the idea of pride began. The first pride march was on Hollywood Boulevard. Morris Kite was in the front, ex-communist, expelled communist. So credit where credit is due.
Exactly, this will be 50 years. It'll be 50 years from the first Pride Parade.
Excellent. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, it's amazing. To go back, it's funny. I'm old enough to have met Dorothy Healey as well, and I used to listen to her show all the time on KBFK. And I remember I never went to her house, but I knew where she lived, and everyone knew she lived there because when the period of so-called white flight, she refused to leave. Which I thought was really impressive. But I remember the thing about Dorothy was she was so little. She was so short.
Just 5 feet tall.
And I was like, how could this person be so powerful? And I reviewed her book for Tikkun back in 1990, it'll be 30 years. And such an extraordinary figure. And one of the things I so appreciate about the book is that, no one really has written about the Che Lumumba Club. No one has really written about, the importance of Kimber Franklin Alexander, for example, and Deacon Alexander, that whole family and the connection to Angela Davis. It's something that's also really, really valuable about the book, the history of the left that we don't really know about or is really underreported. I wanted to pivot because I know Glyn had a question, which is about the left. And then we're going to go back to the book, which is, he's interested, and I'm interested too, to know your opinion about the US left today, whether it's the Democratic Socialists of America or other left groups responding to the recent uprisings. And to connect it back to the book, LA is unique, and Mike is so right about, the kind of the left coast of the Communist Party, but it's also unique for the explosion of other left organizations that emerged out of California, out of LA. And I'm curious to know both of your assessments of the left today, if there's any kind of lessons or legacies we can draw from LA then, or this is a different left.
Well, for me, probably the high point of the whole period that we've studied was the Black Congress. The Black Congress emerged after the Watts Revolt, and it brought together all the groups that were influenced by Black nationalism and Black power, ranging from the Community Alert Patrol, which was a Los Angeles-based group, which followed the police around and watched and recorded and reported as they harassed, beat Black people. The LAPD, you have no idea how how much they hated this. You know, it was like the rats suddenly, you know, exposed to sunlight. But you had that. You had one of the, I think probably the first Black draft resistance group in the country, Freedom Draft Movement, headed by a guy who was my mentor, and I mean, he was like my big brother in the period, Levi Kingston, who died just before the book came out. You had the Black Communist Youth. You had the largest and most influential group, which was us, which was headed by a remarkable and extremely controversial figure, Ron Karenga, who'd been one of the civil rights and young radicals at LA City College, along with Franklin Alexandra, back in 1966, 61. And you had the LA-based Black Panther Party. There were several local Black Panther parties that grew up in the same period as the Oakland branch. But later, Oakland came down and asserted its prerogatives. So you had us, the Panthers, the Communists, Community Alert Patrol, and all kinds of people. And they had a headquarters and group. And this was the, you know, the high point of Black unity. So the war that was unleashed, largely at the instigation of the police and the FBI's COINTEL program, that set up bloody encounters between the Panthers and us, destroyed the Black Congress. But one has to ask, you know, what if that Black United Front had continued, even just for a year or two more, coinciding with the height of Black high school and junior college rebellions, with the beginning of the organization of younger Black workers. One of the groups that most impressed me, and I worked with for a while, was a group of young veterans working at the Central Post Office, the old Central Post Office Terminal Annex, who just joined the Black Panther Party. And it was in the same period in the big auto plant in Fremont, in the Bay Area, there was the Black Panther caucus. So there was, you know, obviously a new avenue opening up that the Panthers might have become something more like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, which, by the way, is the group I would say that so many people saw really as the leading group, the paradigm, the model in this period before massive structural and unemployment set in the manufacturing sector.
John?
One of the biggest differences between the 60s and today is what we saw among the Black radical groups was intense rivalries that ended up in an internecine, murderous war between the Panthers and us, fueled, of course, by the FBI COINTELPRO, which, you know, set out to set these two groups against each other and get them shooting at each other. And it ended with, I mean, it climaxed with two Panthers being shot and killed by us members at UCLA, Bunchy Carter and John Huggins. Today, we don't see rivalry, mutual hostility among the community groups here in LA. I mean, if we look at the People's Budget, which is the group that's proposed cutting the police, initiated by Black Lives Matter, but endorsed by Community Coalition, which is a very big community organizing group, has been around for 20 years or so, and in South LA. LANE, the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is supported by the progressive labor unions. They have all worked together on this program to create a progressive budget that would reduce funding for the police tremendously and put the money instead into schools, healthcare, jobs programs, youth programs, community programs of different kinds. So I think that is that is one of the encouraging signs and part of the good news about what's happening right now.
Right. That's actually a perfect place for me to before we get to the conclusion, this other question I have, which is about identity, so-called identity politics, in the way that even today, there's a sense that, oh, well, you know, what's great about the movements at the moment is that people have kind of shunned their identity politics for some kind of larger class-based universal set of claims. But what you show in the book, both on chapters about the gay liberation movement and on chapters on feminism in health clinics, that the kind of politics that we tend to associate with sort of gender or sexual politics were also politics making demands for fundamental transformation of society. So, you know, the fact that Carl Whitman could produce this extraordinary manifesto for gay liberation, the Gay Liberation Front, comes out of the struggles in Griffith Park, and that what they're demanding is a transformative politics grounded on intersectional oppression, that is anti-imperialism, anti-racism, class politics, feminist politics. And then later you have a feminist movement, you talk about many different kinds of feminisms, that's about welfare rights, that's about healthcare, that's about not just the right to an abortion, but the right not to be subjected to forced sterilization. So and again, race, anti-imperialist, class politics, all that combined. And that's not the story we usually hear. And if you can just both talk about, you know, what we learn from movements that often are the most marginalized, but actually are making demands that are so fundamental to the transformation of not just the US, but the world.
I think the most fascinating example in this period is the rejection of hyphenated ethnicity by kids on the east side of LA, who decided that they're no longer Mexican Americans, which implied a project of assimilation along the lines of, say, Eastern and Southern European immigrants, in favor of a new racialized identity as Chicanos, which was in fact a recognition by that generation that their conditions in their community and their specific repression was similar to that of Black youth in South Central LA. And to some extent, the movement's Chicano movement was criticized, including by other Chicano groups, particularly more left-wing groups in the Bay Area, as being cultural nationalist. But in fact, the cultural nationalism never led into a kind of ethnic sectarianism at all. And you can, you know, debate the accuracy of some of the historical claims and origin myths that were involved in the identity. But it was a tremendously powerful force. And likewise, other groups, to an extent that often is not obvious immediately, were so influenced by Black struggle and by the emergence of Black power, as well as by Black nationalist organizations. I mean, and you've written about this, Robin, but I mean, one of the crucial questions always facing African-American people in this country is, do they have any reliable allies? Mm. And the answer is only episodically, which is, you know, why when you look at, you know, at Malcolm X, you know, he was absolutely right. You know, where were the allies? You know, if it'd been back in 1948, yeah, I mean, there was the Communist Party and some of the unions, but in the late 1950s, early 1960s, there weren't obvious allies. And of course, that's what makes the situation different today. Although all the enthusiasm about white kids and white people turning out should not obscure the fact that the fundamental alliance here is everywhere you look, starting with Minnesota. With Minneapolis itself, this is a Black Latino thing. You know, it's Black Puerto Rican, it's Black Mexican, and again, in the experience of my own kids, is the Mexican immigrant kids and the Black kids in inner city high schools. I mean, they hang together in a way that you know, wouldn't have been at all possible in the 1960s. And that differentiates the conditions today and holds out the promise of more lasting and powerfully cemented movements.
But on the question of white allies, there is one turning point moment in LA in the 60s. You know, for a lot of the 60s, the national focus was on the South, segregation in the South, violence in the South, Birmingham, Selma. We need the Civil Rights Act. We need the, you know. In 1967, LBJ opened his re-election campaign with a fundraiser in Los Angeles, because Los Angeles was the second or third biggest Democratic source of funds and of votes anywhere in the country. He picked the brand new Century Plaza Hotel in this new glamorous office shopping complex, Century City. And it was $1,000 a plate dinner, and all the Hollywood celebrities were supposed to show up at this. The anti-war movement, especially the whites in the anti-war movement, organized a gigantic demonstration to protest the war in Vietnam, which was reaching a peak in the summer of 1967. White groups from all over Southern California met in Rancho Park. Muhammad Ali had just been stripped of his title and indicted for draft resistance. He came and spoke to this rally. Dr. Spock, the famous child care expert and leading peace activist, was there. And then they marched up to the Century City Hotel where this $1,000 plate dinner was going on. 10,000 white, mostly white people, old, young, with their kids. And 1,000 LAPD cops attacked them, spent the next hour beating people, chasing them through the streets of this construction site. White LA, for the first time, didn't just sympathize with Black people being attacked by the police. They themselves were the targets of this attack. The ACLU did a huge report. The LA Free Press published a special issue. And that is the turning point when especially the liberal west side of LA turns against the mayor, turns against the LAPD, support the first Black candidate for mayor, Tom Bradley, who was the city councilman representing at that time an integrated district in the South Side. In 1969, 2 years later, Bradley almost wins the Democratic primary because of massive grassroots organizing everywhere in West LA. 4 years after that, he finally does succeed. So LA gets a Black mayor because of the LAPD finally turning on white people on the occasion of a huge anti-war march. By the way, LBJ gave up his campaign for re-election, pulled out of that race, and Richard Nixon was elected in 1968.
Right. This is a great moment. I have all these questions I have to ask coming from the audience, but just to follow up on the Mayor Bradley issue, because in the epilogue, this is a very, very important part of the story, that Bradley's election in '73 was in many ways a turning point. But as you write, and I just want to quote, with his electoral, you talk about his electoral base, you know, stabilizing, consolidating the kind of liberal patronage with the West Side big developers, the West Side moguls, the major banks. And you say here, in historical retrospect, Bradley's greatest accomplishments were not his attacks on residential segregation, which is something that he fought, or or direction of public investment to have-not neighborhoods, but rather the rebirth of downtown property values in the creation of a state-of-the-art infrastructure for the globalization of the metropolitan economy in the 1990s. So in some ways, Bradley's victory was a victory, but it wasn't a victory. So I really want to hear from you about this. And does that mean that Eric Garcetti is the mayor that we've been waiting for? Maybe that's rhetorical. But just if you could say something about this, and I'm going to take the other questions coming up.
Well, in the first mayoral campaign, Tom Bradley, who'd been a black cop for years and years under Chief Parker, and then won a council seat, ran as the nominee of a coalition of forces. Actually, the Black Liberal Coalition had first come together even before Century City in the Crenshaw area, which was African American. It was also Japanese American, and Japanese Americans were actually prominent in the first Bradley campaign, and it was Jewish. It was one of the few really integrated parts of Los Angeles. But this was a largely, a grassroots movement, which had support both in the largely white anti-war movement, but also in the part of the Black community on the West Side that was most dependent on public employment, a kind of nascent Black middle class in Los Angeles. And one of his later accomplishments as mayor was that actually he greatly enlarged the scope of Black public employment, which solidified his traditional base. But the 73 Tom Bradley is a different animal. And the campaign had been taken over and managed from the top down by professional Democratic politicians and by West Side money. And in some ways, it was a reconciliation event for the West Side elites and the town elites, which have been warring with each other for years and years. And the one figure who remained, and this confirms John's point about the importance of kind of old left cadre in these movements, is his chief advisor was a guy named Maury Wiener. And he was one of the people who'd show up at Dorothy's house every now and then. I mean, he was a genuinely left-wing progressive guy. And he was destroyed when the LAPD staged an arrest in a Hollywood theater because Wiener was gay. And it destroyed his career, and it removed the one really progressive voice from the Bradley administration. And Bradley, with money from West Side entertainment elites, but also the support of the LA Times and some of the traditional elites, became almost impregnable in power. But his greatest weakness was revealed when plant closures began at the end of the 70s, which the eastern poor part of the Black community, which had just begun to make major gains in gaining entry into manufacturing plants. And Bradley basically didn't lift a finger. And it's, of course, out of the scorched earth of deindustrialization and also things like this massively destructive freeway project, the Century Freeway, in whose scorched earth the first crib sets emerged, which became, the center of just the incremental destruction of the community, producing the conditions for the 1992 uprising.
Right.
with a protege of, in fact, he was the former chauffeur of Chief Parker, Chief Gates, and his, mindlessly destructive war against gangs and street narcotics.
So what we see with Tom Bradley is we see in so many other areas of where we got a black mayor, but the radical core was lost and he became a liberal downtown development advocate. Didn't do anything to change the LAPD. The job picture for most of Black Los Angeles got worse during the Bradley years. Gay liberation, instead of gay liberation, we end up with gay marriage. Women's liberation, we end up with jobs, careers opening to women, but nothing like the vision of women's liberation that we learned about in the 60s and early 70s. So the story of our book is a story of the defeat of the radical movements, the success of some liberal fronts. But our theme is this isn't the end of the story, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
That's right. That's right. To follow up, one of the questions from the audience asked about the LA Free Press. And the question is, why did they not survive? Now, we know the LA Free Press still exists, but the question, I think, is, why did it not survive the way it was in terms of dealing with these issues? The issues haven't gone away.
Well, I'd say there's two key factors. First of all, the end of the 60s, in our review, and though many others, ended around 1973, 1974. A lot of things that had been thriving and energetic shut down, and with the end of Nixon and Watergate, the end of the Vietnam War, a lot of things ended. And the LA Free Press was one of them. Excuse me. There was one big event that really hurt the LA Free Press badly as an organization, and that is it seemed like a good idea at the time. They were given a list of over 100 undercover narcs. It was actually the Christmas card list of the narcotic squad, and so they printed it, and they were sued for millions of dollars by the cops and by the police. It wasn't actually a crime. They hadn't stolen this. It was a gift that they Xeroxed and gave back, but the financial burden of fending off these gigantic lawsuits, and it's still a little unclear, did they ever pay? They agreed to pay some of the cops. I think maybe they never did, but that crippled the paper as an organization for quite a while after that. And they came more to rely on sex ads. And of course, the women's movement protested openly against supporting the radical press with sex ads. They tried buying their own. They made some other management errors. They tried buying their own 24. They had trouble being printed, actually, after this lawsuit. The printer refused to print them anymore under pressure from the DA and the police. They bought their own printing press. That was a tremendous financial burden. So there's a lot of factors that went into the decline of the LA Free Press, but the counterculture press, the underground press all across America was cutting back and shutting down as the 70s began.
Here's another question that both of you could probably take, which is, or you and I could take. Are BLM or other similar movements today organizing congresses or according to communist socialist methods more generally, for example, having the general meetings, which are common in earlier periods? So it's really about the organizing methods of Black Lives Matter and related organizations compared to those in the past, the Congress idea or the general meeting. Any thoughts on that question, Mike?
Well, I must say I'm something of an unreconstructed Leninist in that I believe that an organization of organizers remains essential. When you're operating across so many fronts, And I think it's clear that the movement will grow and diversify over the next year. It cannot help but do that because of the catastrophe that's befallen working people in this country and the current generation of 16 to 25-year-olds. But it's also because an organization of organizers becomes an archive of experience, of discussion, and of debates. Now, people familiar with the 60s and 70s experience and the disastrous histories of particularly the Maoist groups, but also some of the Trotskyist groups as well, will say, well, you can't have democracy in such an organization of organizers in this party form. And that's, of course, a tremendously valid point to make. Something we don't really explore much because it occurs a little bit later. The LA left did not disappear,
Right.
Particularly the white left, but elements of the black left. Punctually in 1973, it continued, but it went down so many blind alleys and took on such a kind of Stalinist form in groups like the Revolutionary, the Communist Party, and so on. So yeah, all that is a valid critique, but I don't think you can get around the central question of how do you conserve experience, debate it, groom new leaders. One of the problems with the current left, I mean, you look at the DSA or Jacobin or groups like that, or the International Socialist Organization, the continuer of the kind of independent Trotskyist movement, which folded up a year ago. And none of these groups really organize working class youth or provide the kind of structure that working class people need in an organization that can acknowledge their basic survival needs. And this becomes even more important in the present situation. But the point is, I mean, look around the country. I mean, to me, the most encouraging and exciting thing is that overwhelmingly what you're seeing are not just college students, right, or left-wing trust fund babies. You're seeing working class kids, white, black, Latino, Asian. And the whole goal of a revolutionary organization is that it needs to become an expression of the people that it claims to represent, and needs to bring them to leadership, and needs to sociologically mirror working class forces. And I don't see much examples of that. I mean, Black Lives Matter, though it isn't really a party or multi-issue organization. I mean, maybe something of an exception. And of course, there's not much debate about party building anymore either, for reasons that are, historically justified because of the fate of new left organizations that followed a kind of Maoist or Stalinist route.
What Black Lives Matter has done that's impressed me so much, at least here in LA, is these community forums, especially recently around the idea of the people's budget. I wouldn't have thought this was possible, but they are very democratic. They want community people to think about what kind of public safety organizations would you actually like your city to run? What kind of help would you like your tax dollars to pay for? And I mean, it's been a lot harder with the stay-at-home order. They've been trying to do it online, but they've gotten hundreds, in some cases thousands of people participating in these community forums shared by other groups. I mean, Community Coalition, I mentioned them before in South LA. They've been around for 20 or 30 years. They are a group that grooms community leaders starting at the grassroots, and then some of them end up on the city council. some of them end up in Congress. They too are running these same sort of things, so that when people say, well, you know, you want to abolish the police, what do you want? Thousands of people have been spent, you know, weeks and months discussing that at these community forums. I'm very impressed.
Right, that's so true. And just for the viewing audience, especially those who may not be in the U.S., people need to know, and you all both know this, there's a distinction between Black Lives Matter as an organization and the Movement for Black Lives, which is a coalition of nearly 100 organizations, and then all these other formations, the Rising Majority, We Charge Genocide, the Black Youth Project 100. There's all these organizations that are doing precisely this. And that is trying to hold forums, trying to emulate what happened in Jackson, Mississippi with the People's Forums, where the election of a progressive mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Lumumba I, was a result of communities coming out and actually publicly debating and discussing what is it we need and how do we get it. And so there's a kind of really massive democratic process that's actually facilitated by social media, even though social media may play the opposite role by convincing people that likes and numbers is the same as organizing, which, you know, this goes back to, I think, Mike's point, that this, you know, you can't simply count people and say that's organization. So it's a really unique moment right now. And it's very exciting. I don't want to lose our time because I got a bunch of questions. This question I'm gonna read because if I paraphrase it, I will change the meaning to what I want it to be. So here's the question. Is the story of LA a story of race or a story of revolution more broadly? And lastly, as the epicenter of popular neoliberalism, the Hollywood machine, is it even possible for the city to be one of revolution or only another cog of neoliberal approved protest?
Neoliberal protest?
Yeah, neoliberal approved protest.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I'm reading the question.
I mean, look, LA has been constructed in the imagination of the world, largely from a perspective of the city seen from Mulholland Drive and from the industry, as it's called. And its immense blue-collar flatlands, communities of aerospace workers and South Central LA, the East Side, its innumerable industrial suburbs have always remained kind of invisible. But if you look at those communities, you end up with entirely different image in many ways of Los Angeles. The whole idea that Los Angeles is just a movable movie set and that everything's ephemeral and superficial. Well, go to the East Side. And in the East Side communities, the Chicano communities, there's an absolutely profound sense of neighborhood identity of the past, equivalent to that of the most tightly organized and culturally conscious neighborhoods you'd find any Eastern industrial city. I mean, LA was in the 1960s becoming the second largest industrial city in the United States. And by the 1970s or early 80s, it surpassed Chicago as the second manufacturing city. This immense blue-collar city. And I met people who'd grown up in LA who told me they'd never seen a factory in Los Angeles, which is something like the West Side deli map view of the world. I worked in the industrial East Side, and it's a vast universe of factories and industrial workplaces. And of course, what really put an end in some ways to the hopes of the 60s was that a battle which we kind of poorly chronicle, because much of it occurred just a little bit later, was the struggle to gain entry and upward mobility in industrial Los Angeles by Blacks and Chicanos. So that by the end of the 70s, you had, really significant stratum of young Black and Chicano workers, many of them veterans of the war in Vietnam. And the importance of having industrial bases to support community politics and vice versa. This was in some ways the strategic goal or vision, which so many of us had. And deindustrialization and plant closure, followed then by the persecution of the subsistence economies of South Central, the East Side. I mean, the tremendous damage was done when you no longer had these big industrial plants and powerful union locals involved in the struggle for racial justice.
We open we open our book on LA in the 60s by saying that race was the issue of issues. And the initial struggles were around segregated housing and segregated schools and police brutality against Black people. And that remains the story for much of the 60s, and it has returned today. Excuse me. The greatest thing I think about the demonstrations we've seen over the last couple of weeks is that these really these are not demonstrations against Donald Trump. These go much deeper. These go to, the original sin of America, slavery and its legacy. And that's much more profound, much more significant. And the fact that it is now the issue that has America in movement, that's a huge thing.
Right. And that's the question I began with. I mean, exactly. So we got about 3 minutes. And so I'm going to close with just one last question, but also respond to a very wonderful question, but can be answered by reading the book. And that is the role that teachers and coaches played in some of these high school rebellions. It's complicated. And I'm telling you, buy that book because you want to find out what happened, because in some cases, some of the teachers almost went to prison for a very long time. Other teachers waged their own strike against the students. So it's a complicated, wonderful, beautiful story. So Dr. Sophie Cooper, definitely get the book. My last question for all of you actually builds on something that Glyn, wants us to think about. And that is the future. You have this beautiful epilogue that brings us right to 2019 and just about to 2020, but the book had to come out. And the basic question is this, the book does end with a message of hope. How hopeful are you both in terms of the coming period, given what we've known? And I just want to add, it's unfair to sort of connect all of your years and years of work to this one book. Both of you have produced amazing scholarship that covers not just the 20th century, but back to the 19th century. In other words, you have a very long view of American history and the world. So are you hopeful about the coming period? And we'll both end on that, both John and Mike.
I don't think hope is a scientific category. I always get asked, are you a pessimist or hopeful? And to be honest with you, I don't think those are particularly meaningful things. People revolt because they have to. People fight for what is humanly necessary. And what distinguishes revolutionaries from liberals more than anything else is liberals' willingness to sacrifice the necessary for what they consider to be the possible or the realistic. And again, a reason for having organizations with broader political goals is because they can be the force inside the larger movement that insists on the necessary fights and refuses to accomplish necessary demands. Now, we live in a period right now, we're in a sudden, accelerated, almost unbelievable transition from a political terrain where New Deal type solutions, that is a second Bill of Rights, which has been really the substance of the Sanders campaign, okay, on one hand. And on the other hand, you know, people woke up one morning, looked out the window, and it was 1933 again, okay? And this is a very different, very different, you know, terrain. So, I mean, to the extent I use the category of hope, hope exists on the broadest scale, you know, in the current generation of fighters that have emerged across the board. The fact that socialism, whatever people construe its meaning, is more popular in capitalism amongst people under 30 years old. But we have to understand that what lies ahead of us are truly dark times and levels of repression beyond anything we've seen probably since the 1960s, or even more. I mean, there's a kind of cargo cult, I think, built around the idea that, you know, Biden's elected, the Democrats, you know, come back. Somehow America returns to its true angels and better self and all of that. That ain't gonna, you know, happen. We need fighters for the long run. I mean, we're in the midst of a global crisis, which has no way out other than revolutionary solutions.
That's your next book, Mike.
Well, I learned from Rebecca Solnit that hope is different from optimism. You hope not because you're optimistic, you hope because you never know. And if there's one thing we've learned in the last couple of months is you never know what's going to happen next. I mean, how many cell phone videos have we seen of police killing Black men? You know, dozens. There's no, I mean, even the phrase "I can't breathe." We've had a cell phone of that one before. You know, that was who was that? Eric Garner. You know, it's the same story, but this time you didn't know it was going to happen, but it happened. When we finished this book, you know, we thought, well, where's their cause for hope? Well, maybe it's the Bernie thing will happen, you know, and because if there's one thing we've learned is you don't know what's going to happen next. So you might as well be hopeful and you might as well get to work. Because it's, as Mike says, you know, the pandemic, the economic crisis that's coming with the pandemic is going to be a tremendous thing for years to come that we're going to have to deal with. And obviously Joe Biden isn't up to this. So we don't know what's going to happen next. And that's why we can be hopeful.
Right. It's like what Gramsci says, although he got it from Romain Rolland, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, you know. And I have to say that I've learned so much from this book and from the stories that both of you tell that, you know, it reminds us that we have to have a kind of pessimism of the catastrophe that's coming, but optimism that we actually can win and must for our own survival. So thank you both. I know Glyn may want to join at the end and say some closing words, but thank you both for this conversation. It was just so enlightening and powerful.
Thank you, Robin.
And for the book.
Thank you, Robin.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, John. And thank you to our audience. I hope it's been as stimulating to you as it has been to me. I would like to finish on the thought of the optimism of the will. Also to echo Robin by encouraging people to read the book and absorb its message of hope. And I take the points about the nature of hope, I suppose. But again, one of my abiding memories of the book is the phrase at the very beginning, actually, that the 60s were when the seeds of social justice were sown. And perhaps we can think that today we're beginning to see some of those seeds flourish. Right. So on behalf of the LSE and the Sociology Department, thanks very much to all of you. And perhaps we'll meet again in person soon and continue this discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.